good evening, and welcome to Kunstinstituut Melly for those who might be new, and welcome back to Kunstinstituut Melly to those who are familiar, friends, associates, part of the family that we have here. My name's Vivian Zahel. I'm the Research and Programs Manager, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's program, which is a books program with the title The One and the Many Textiles and Tulip Petals. So this evening's program happens on quite a special occasion, which is that it is the closing weekend of the exhibition Still Shifting Mother Field by the artist Jennifer T, who's with us and who will be joining the conversation shortly. This exhibition's been with us since January 20, so since the depths of winter after Christmas, and we're now in the height of spring. And there's something about that seasonal shift that's very apt to the work, where the production is so intertwined with the cultivation, the collection, and the collaging of tulip petals, which no doubt will be discussed in the program. I won't introduce the speakers, as that will be the task of our moderator, who we're delighted to welcome back, Christel Vesters, who we've worked with over the years. And it's a pleasure, once we're returning to textiles in particular, to work with Christel once again. I'll just note that the program focuses on the book publication that accompanies this exhibition. And the exhibition opened, first of all, with our commissioning partners, the Vienna Secession. It is then travelled to us, and this will be the conclusion of the show. So the exhibition now kind of continues in a new life, which is the life of the book. And there's something to consider in that, in relation to also the concerns of the Tampan Tulip series and the gap, or the sort of the uncanny paradox between the gap of art and craft, or art and design, as it emerged in the colonial mind over a certain period of time, and as remains in sort of the uncanny twins of the ethnographic and the art museum. So as just a few words of framing, that's the introduction for the evening. We'll have 2 rounds of guests with a presentation and then some commentaries. We have a welcome, of course, for Q&A, and then for some refreshments at the end. So please be welcome to stay and ask and be in conversation informally. Before we start, I'd also like to say one very special word, given that we are spending time with the book tonight, which is also to thank and acknowledge Wendy Slakmat-Boss, our colleague with us here, who worked in a very, very dedicated way with the exhibition, but also very deeply in compiling and supporting the production of this publication. So to start with, a little word of thanks in that direction as well. So I now hand over to Christel and look forward to enjoying the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it works. Huh? Yeah. Okay. So yes, thank you, Vivian, for the introduction and for the invitation to this evening's event. I need to thank Simon for your technical assistance. PowerPoint nerd. And thank you, Sophia, who's not here, but everyone at Melly for giving us such a beautiful exhibition. And of course, thank you, Jennifer, for being such an inspirational artist. So, having said that, as Vivian said, my name is Christel Vesters, and my job here this evening is to help navigate the rich and multi-layered and intricately connected oeuvre of Jennifer T, as is on show upstairs in the exhibition Still Shifting Mother Field, and present in the beautifully designed catalogue. This one, Tampan Tulip. See, I always get those things mixed up. Ideally, tonight we'll have a conversation where you join in as an audience, so please feel free to interrupt me. I don't know what the other people think about that, but you can interrupt me if I say something that you think is completely out there, and or I go too fast or too slow. I think most of you know Jennifer's work, but for those of you who don't, I'll read the short text with which she describes herself. Jennifer T, 1973, Her work comprised sculpture, installation, performance, photography, and collage, all with a wide-ranging underlying frame of reference. Of central importance is Tsw's interest in the in-between state of what she calls the soul in limbo. The soul in limbo is restless and alive and caught in an unnamed place, a conceptual, mental, psychological, and physical space on the border between the here and the possible. They also researches contemporary life with its cross-cultural identity and narratives, its instability and complexity, and its potential for the loss of identity, language, and kinship with original cultures. In addition, Tsw explores various forms of utopian concepts of life and their potential for creating a new and more beautiful and soulful world. With her work, she encourages the contemplation of life's fragile connections, evoking spiritual realms with active material experimentation. And I think those three things, the life's fragile connections, the connection to spiritual realms, and the active material experimentation, are three of the tropes, if you want, that will kind of resonate during tonight's talk. Jennifer will join us later together with Cleo, who designed the catalogue. For now, she's looking at me and like, feeling her eyes in my, ready to interject. Anyway, I have been following Jennifer and her work for quite some time, and we've had the pleasure of working together, and I've had the pleasure of taking some deep dives into her oeuvre on a number of occasions, most recently in the exhibition that I curated, Interwoven Histories. And each time there were new layers to discover. And one of my passions and things that I share with Jennifer is an interest in old textiles, and textile as a metaphor or as a material and as an artistic medium. So as you will notice tonight, I tend to use a lot of textile metaphors when I talk about the work of artists such as Jennifer, or about the world in general. It's a typical case of beroepsdeformatie or professional deformation, but I also think textile and textile techniques are a very apt and meaningful model to understand the complexities and entanglements of the world around us. And with that I mean it's a model that is presenting a possibility to think through different threads or different strands holding each other in place, but at the same time suppressing another or lifting another up. So it's intricately structured around power hierarchies. So that's been one of the things that's been in my mind when I looked at Jennifer's work. Like textiles, the fabric of our realities and of our histories consists of many different threads, each with its own social, cultural, geographical point of origin, each with its own unique identity, which, when woven together, these threads, sometimes consenting, sometimes conflicting, create new surfaces that absorb and reflect the here and now. At the same time, when someone sits behind a loom and weaves or cross stitches or embroiders a piece of linen or repairs a hole in our favorite sweater. Anyone? No? Okay. The thread in our hands connects our hands with our eyes and connects our minds with our hearts, and it connects our body, our minds, and our souls across what Jennifer calls a conceptual, mental, psychological, and physical space. So it's all about connectivity and entanglement. And at the same time, when we move the thread which connect through the loom or over the linen, the thread connects us to those women and men who across time and place have made that same movement. So it's also kind of quite a bodily, if you want, meditative experience where we can find ourselves in that place of connection. So as you notice, this dictionary of textile metaphors is endless. And I also think that textile offers a productive thought form to enter the multi-layered and interconnected fabric of Jennifer's work, which we will attempt to do this evening with the guidance of two experts, Dr. Wonu Veys and Curator Sophie Williamson, who each come from their own domain of expertise and will follow some of the threads that run through Jennifer's work. Because of the thematic and material scope of Jennifer's oeuvre, for this evening we have decided to focus on her series of tulip tampons, Tampan Tulips, a number of which, 12, can be seen upstairs. But before I introduce Dr. Wonu Veys, maybe we can switch to the other PowerPoint. Oh, it's already there. Oh, okay. So I would like to unwind one of the historical threads that runs through this series of Tampan Tulips, and which follows the story of the Tampan and Palepai cloth from Lampung, Indonesia. So this is going to be a very short historical lecture. Tampan and Palepai are the 17th and 18th century hand-woven textiles from the Lampung region in Sumatra. So here you see the map, and you saw the map. And along with their beautiful geometric design and skilled craftsmanship, the cloths depict abstract motifs like those of ships, trees, humans, and other living creatures. The ceremonial cloth were woven by experienced craftspeople, were mainly women, and used at different social functions, marking rites of passage, rites of passage, birth, marriage, death, and the like. So the tampan are the square, hand-woven ceremonial cloths, and they were more common amongst lay people, so not lay people, just the regular people. They were used to wrap gifts that were exchanged between families at those ceremonies, whereas the oblong palepai were the prerogative of the aristocracy. They were a symbol of their wealth and their status, and they would sometimes measure 3 meters in width, and they became part of a family heirloom and served often as a backdrop for ceremonies, again marking the cycles of life. In the West, in the West, the tampan became known as the ship cloths, based on their central motif of the ship, which symbolized movement and passage from this world to the next. In more elaborative examples, the prow and stern of the ship are surrounded with naturalistic motifs of birds, sea creatures, and human figures. The boat is the world, with mankind as its crew, floating on the sea with aquatic creatures under the heavenly realms where the gods live, and with the birds as their messengers. There's also life around the boat. So as I said, you see the birds flying the sky, and in the sea there swim fish, turtles, jellyfish, and crabs. And most of the motifs you can find also in Jennifer's tampan. So we'll talk about that later, how she transformed or kind of adopted or appropriated, whatever we want to call it, the symbols from the historical tampan, and kind of reworked them into her own symbolical vocabulary. But to get back to Lampung, the sea was their lifeline, and therefore the ship therefore plays an important role in their local cosmology and myth. In this, the ship is the metaphor for the journey we all take in this life. And in some rocks, this ship's mast merges into the trunk of a tree of life, symbolizing lineage and family. The tampan and the palepai are beautiful examples, and I'll wrap it up here, where local tradition and aesthetics are combined with manifold cultural religious influences from abroad. So again, this idea of textile being a carrier of interconnected threads already holds true for these 16th and 17th century ethnographic textiles, which, because they were introduced in a region which was situated on the Sunda Strait, which was the Lampung area was also an important region for the cultivation of pepper, and therefore a well-connected trading destination. So the experts, I brought a really beautiful book. They trace back some of the symbols and some of the iconography to very old symbolisms and visual languages that date back to the 11th, 12th century and even earlier. And I think what might be an interesting point to talk to you about later, Wonu, is this idea of the point of origin and how it always dissolves when you think you're near the point of origin. It falls into a multitude of other origins. So to wrap up the story about the Tampan, in 1883, a massive volcanic eruption and tsunami devastated the area, killing over 35,000 people and marking the end of the Tampan and Palepai production at that time, which will also gives us another interesting topic to talk about later when we talk about the afterlife of things. I think I'll stop here. So maybe we can switch to the PowerPoint of Wonu as I introduce you. And I can sit back and relax and listen to you talk. Yeah. So Dr. Fanny Wonu Veys is a curator of Oceania at the National Museum of World Cultures, where she has curated the Mana Maori exhibition in 2010, the exhibition Things That Matter, an exhibition on Australian art, also the exhibition What a Genderful World, and A Sea of Islands. She also co-curated a barkcloth exhibition in Tapa, titled Tapa, Étoffe Cosmique d'Océanie in Cahors in France, and Migrating Objects, Arts of Africa, Oceania and the Americas in the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice. Her expertise includes Pacific art and material culture, museums and cultures of collecting, textiles in the Pacific, gender and material culture, missionary collecting, and the significance of historical objects today. She has published dozens of articles in journals and books and is the editor of Provenance, which is again published by the National Museum of World Cultures. She is the president of the Pacific Arts Association Europe, and in 2022 she held the Barbro Klein Fellowship at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies in Uppsala. Wow. So Woni will first give her impression of her response basically of the exhibition of Jennifer, and we'll talk a bit about the bark cloths as they relate to the multiple registers of sensibility.
Thank you.
To you.
Is this switched on? Yes, it is. Well, thank you very much for this really kind introduction. And also thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Actually, when I received the invitation, when Vivian contacted me, I thought I was really not the right person to be in touch with, because I told her as well, saying, well, I'm not a specialist on Indonesian textiles, on Tampan textiles, so I'm not sure whether I have much to say with regard to this exhibition. Vivian replied, but she said, like, actually, we're looking for kind of a wider perspective. So that's why I'm kind of showing this slideshow in the background. I'm not going to talk to the slides, but it just gives you an idea of what I have been working with, which is barkcloth, which is a non-woven textile, but which has a lot of similar things that I will touch upon in giving my impression to the exhibition, but it has a lot of similar aspects actually to the textiles, but also to Jennifer's exhibition. And so it touches on these wider themes that I think are important and interesting. So I was very lucky that I had the opportunity to see the exhibition and to really take my time going through it. And one of the first things that struck me was the kind of the fragility and the ephemeral aspect of the work. Because Jennifer works, as you all know, with tulip petals. And of course, they're very fragile, they don't last long, they're very difficult to conserve. And that was something that really struck me and that kind of resonated with me also in relation to barkcloth. Because if you think of it, barkcloth is made out of the inner bark of a tree. It can be different trees. Here in Tonga, it's the paper mulberry tree. but it's made out of plant material, and that plant material actually protects the inner core of the flower for tulips, or of the tree for in the case of paper mulberry tree. And so that immediately kind of resonated with me, this connection, so that was one of the first things, but also this aspect of protection. I thought that was really important, because also with the performance that we just saw, textiles are usually used to kind of wrap people in or wrap presents in, or protect the kind of inner core. So there again, you see this similarity with the tulip petals protecting reproductive organs of the tulip, and also with people, it protects kind of the inner core of people, their inner being, and it creates this second skin. So that was also something that really talked to me. Then when you look at the kind of motifs, the kind of topics that are touched upon through the motifs as well, of course the boats is a very important aspect. So the traveling, the journey that people make, and so that can be interpreted as the inner journey that you make, the physical journey from going from place to place, but also it can. Well, for me, it also kind of goes back to the ancestral journey. So what your ancestors have gone through and have also passed on to you through their journeys that they have made. And that, again, is something that connects to the Pacific, because the Pacific is this place where voyagers and canoes and these big ancestral journeys taken a very important place, and where the sea is seen as a connecting factor and not as something that splits people apart or makes people, puts people at a distance from each other. It's these canoes, these ancestral canoes, but also today's canoes, today's voyages that connect people to each other. And so that was, I thought, really beautiful also in this, in the way that Jennifer also kind of connected that through her work and in her personal journey as well, because I felt that I could see some of the things that she was working with or going through within the works that she had on display. Another aspect, I think, is the texture. And because also the kind of woven works and also the 3D printed works that were activated just earlier, all have this kind of textured aspect, and of course also the tulip petals, where through the prints you can still feel and kind of get a sense of the texture of the tulip leaves, and. So this texture aspect also adds to the experience, because textiles in general are not just something that is visual, something that you just look at, but it's also something that you touch, and also through the making process, it's something that you are physically connected with through the weaving, as Christel also alluded to, but also just to the collecting of the material, transforming the material into something that you can work with. As you can see here, it's a very physical, with barkcloth, it's a very physical activity. It's something that needs strength and physical strength, but also emotional strength to be able to kind of go through the whole process of making that textile. And in that process, it's not only, so it's your body is involved, but also the whole, all your senses are involved, because you can smell the material, you can, usually you don't taste the material, but it's almost through smell you kind of get that experience. But you touch the material. Here you see that very clearly. This woman is checking whether it has the right consistency. You really live with that material. And that was also something that came through, I think, in Jennifer's work, that it's not just something that is pretty to look at, but it's something that is actually lived through and felt through. And especially also with the activation that was even made clearer. What I also liked about the activation was that a lot of the textiles that people are wearing, having on their bodies, also reminded me of, and actually you will see probably a slide, of fishnets. And that kind of goes back to the sea as well. And the glistening pieces in it, it reminded me of fish hooks, but also of the fish kind of going through the water, and that fishermen in the Pacific, but also in Indonesia, use this kind of glistening bait, so that fish think that other fish are swimming there, and so they go through the bait and catch it. And so that was kind of something that I was thinking of when I saw the performance. Because at first I thought, actually, very honestly, I thought there was someone having a mobile phone on them, because it was kind of glimmering in the light. And then I thought, oh, no, it's not a mobile phone. It's just, the ceramic pieces. And so that kind of, made me think of that sea aspect and that kind of glistening aspect, again, going back to the sea, going back to the voyages. So there were a lot of kind of different impressions that I had looking at, and very layered impressions that I had looking at and experiencing Jennifer's work in this exhibition. And I think for now, perhaps that's what I wanted to say. If you can also interrupt me. That's, I forgot to say that, but you could interrupt
later.
Later on.
I'm looking quickly at Jennifer. At Vivian. Vivian, how are we doing time-wise? Good. Okay. So I'll just give you one question before we go to Sophie. A lot of what you talked about, your impressions about Jennifer's work, and of course I can kind of tentatively feel the connection with the barkcloth making, which is, as you say, it's a very physical process that demands perseverance and strength, and as opposed to the more ephemeral qualities of actually also barkcloth. When you see it, it's very fragile. It looks very fragile. But when you describe these kind of this duality, so to speak, what do you think communicates to the audience the most? That's kind of the ephemeral, or all the hard work, the gravitas that went into the work? What's like?
Oh, for me, actually, you don't see the hard work, but it's there. It's only when you really delve into it that you realize that it takes a lot of hard work. And I think that's also, when you look at Jennifer's work, the first thing that comes to mind is the beauty, actually, and the kind of lightness almost, really the beauty. But then when you come closer, you see all the little pieces, and then you think like, wow, this is a lot of work. And the selection of the petals, the picking of the petals, finding the right colors, finding something that matches what you want to do, but also working with the material, because of course the material is not doesn't always automatically come with exactly what you had in mind, I can imagine. So you have to kind of have this connection and this exchange with the material. But I think when you see the work, you don't think of the hard work, but you soon come to realize that it takes a lot of hard work.
Yeah, because it's easy. I'm asking, and maybe my question came out a bit distorted, but I asked you because in our talks, in our preparatory talks, you said something about men make art, women make craft, and of course, when we look and we talk about textile, or we talk about not necessarily the works of Jennifer, but when we talk about art in general, we never talk about the gravity of the muscle and the time, and weaving, for example, it takes a lot of time. And I find when I find that an aspect that fascinating, because that's where the kind of the historical accumulus of all these histories, etc., comes in. It just art doesn't fly out of the window. It really is.
It's very grounded, and it always made me laugh in Tonga when they say, like, women are not supposed to be doing hard work, but they are encouraged to make barkcloth, which is really hard work. And a lot of women say that when they first start making it as young women, like the first days they do it, they couldn't sleep because of the muscle ache that they had beating it. So it always made me laugh that they said that, like, women are not doing hard work in Tonga, but they are, you know. And so it's this idea of, and when I talked about that, often that's more from a colonial perspective. Often women's art was considered as not really kind of art, but more crafts, like an occupation. And I think a lot of the kind of colonial officers and missionaries didn't understand how essential women's arts were and are to society, because also with the Tampan textiles, they are used at essential moments in life. And without those textiles, you cannot go through these essential moments in life. So women are really supporting that part of life. So they are there for every important aspect. And also with barkcloth, it's exactly the same. Women are there when it really matters, I would say. So you can also see they make it, but then they are also there. There's one of the slides where you see a pathway for a funeral, where the girls of a particular school, Queen Charlotte College, are lining the pathway, and not the boys are not lining the pathway. It's the girls who are there to support that important event of a funeral. And I think that was often underestimated, that women kind of carry life, they give life, but they also carry the life till the end. So they're there for funerals, but also for weddings, for important events. In Tonga, for example, they're also there for, when teams win important rugby matches or sports events. So because that's an important event in people's lives, so they are there with their products as well. And
thank you. Well, I think we can ask Jennifer later on what her ideas are about the female touch. Sophie, look, you're pink. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah. So let me introduce Sophie Williamson. Sophie G. Williamson. J. Okay, she's a curator based in London and Margate. She is initiator and convener of Undead Matter, a research program focused on the intimacy of dying and its dialogue with the geological. From 2013 to 2021, she was exhibitions curator at Camden Arts Centre in London, where she, amongst many other things, curated Jennifer Solo's exhibition Let It Come Down in 2017. Before joining the team at Camden Arts Centre, she was part of the inaugural team at Raven Row, London, and in a recent interview that I read, I've done my research, Sophie describes her curatorial drive as a fundamental belief that art acts in the margins between things, and that its ripple effect of ripple-like impact takes form over extended time frames through interactions and connections that are rarely immediately visible but can transcend generational boundaries and even era.
I don't remember saying that, but
you said it.
It sounds like me, yeah.
You said it. Sophie wrote the essay A Tulip is a Tulip is a Tulip in Tay's catalogue, which I highly recommend everyone to read, in which she traces the wanderings of a petal cum feather through different social, political and cultural time frames. So enlighten us.
Thank you so much. Unlike these two wonderful speakers, I am afraid I'm not an expert, but so my talk will be slightly different. And but I do, however, know Jennifer's work quite well. This is an image from the show that we did together at Camden Art Centre. Right, so I need to use this. So something that I've always been drawn to in Jennifer's work is the way that she has this magpie-like curiosity of plucking things up from different cultural contexts. And her works become this kind of cacophony of wondrous insights to beautiful, tantalizing ideas from across the world. But underneath this is a very deeply sympathetic and deep understanding to the kind of entanglements that each of these come into being through. So the invitation, let me see if I can actually put this where I'm writing this. Oh, yeah, wonderful. So the invitation to write for the book was a really wonderful opportunity for me to focus in on one of these aspects of her work and to delve into the interlinking histories in a very precise detail, and one which those of you that are familiar with her work will have seen reoccurring in the works over the last 10 years of these tulip petal tampan collages. So I'm going to take the opportunity to speak a little bit about what I wrote about in the book, which was focusing in on the tulips themselves. I had the joy. Oh, excellent. When I was speaking to Jennifer, first of all, about the direction that we might take this text in, she had this really wonderful insight that she kind of thought about this kinship with the tulip petal, because both she and the tulips come from this history of accumulated migration. So I'm going to speak a little bit to that today, and perhaps because it's about the book and because it's an opportunity for me to read something, and I'm terribly nervous at public speaking, I'm going to read a little bit from it. I have it in front of me. Yeah. The variegated bands of dark crimson, red slash and splutter in veiny streaks across a subdued yellow, in a frenzied clash of colour, a fiery cacophony of activity held within the fragility of a single tulip petal. Or perhaps, if one's gaze shifts, the mottled feathers of an outstretched wing, proudly displaying its majestically ornate plumage. Rose is a rose is a rose, Gertrude Stein notoriously wrote. Whether living or depicted, a rose is so because it is named as such. And yet here, amongst Jennifer T's tulip petal collage, an equally delicate ephemeral flower momentarily builds a world of creatures, figures, ships, and trees, imbued with mythological and historical symbology. We often mistake objects as having boundaries, a point or edge where they end and something else begins. Rather than a world made up of things, things only exist because they enter into relations with others, constantly and vigorously, as the world tirelessly comes into being time and time again. As physicist Carlo Rovelli elucidates, a stone is a vibration of quanta that maintains its structure for a while, just as a marine wave maintains its identity for a while before melting away again into the sea. We, like waves, and like all objects, are a flux of events. We are processes, for a brief time monotonous. We live in a world shaped and formed by infinite movement, interactions, flows, vibrations, and flux, a multitude of ever-shifting exchanges, each imprinted with their pasts. To look closer, what stories are held within this single fiery-coloured petal come feather? How has it come into being? How has it come to be here precisely amongst this regal outstretched birdwing? And how does it hold its duality, both the feather of a mythical bird, steeped in cultural histories, an ephemeral tulip petal, grown this spring and picked by hand? So, the lovely picture of Jennifer. I had the privilege last June of joining Jennifer on her seasonal outing to the tulip fields, where each year she goes to the fields in North Holland and picks tulip petals for the collages that she will then spend the following year making. And what was so wonderful about this, and is very different from the way that I normally work with artists in production, is that we had the date penciled in, but we had to wait for confirmation from the tulip grower, because you have to wait for the very perfect day when they've come into bloom, when they've opened, and the day that we had planned to go, it then rained, and which meant it was pointless to go and pick them because they wouldn't dry well enough. And so it really had this relationship to something beyond art production. It lived in the realm of kind of circadian rhythms and the life of the tulip. So the wonderful Piet, who is Jennifer's regular contact there, showed us around. He's a retired tulip grower, and at this particular location, the Hortus Bulborium, they only grow heritage tulips. It's kind of like a living museum, and they have 2,700 varieties. And what's so wonderful, I think, about working in this way is to realize that Jennifer's work is innately seasonal. It's a practice that can only work with the shifting seasons. It refuses the timescales of exhibition deadlines. It refuses the timescales of art fairs. The work has to be made in the time that it has to be made in, and it takes a long time to kind of pick the petals and dry them, and so there's this innate circadian rhythm embedded in the work. And so, how much time do we have? What are we doing? I might skip this because I think we want to talk about time later. I have a whole bunch of stuff about time, but we can come back to it. So maybe as a kind of complement to the wonderful talks that the two of you have already done around weaving, I wanted to speak more specifically about the history of the petals and how that kind of history comes into Jennifer's work in these collages. So the history of tulips starts deep in the Alborz Mountains, which are mountains stretching from the northern border of modern-day Iran and Azerbaijan and down the coast in the Caspian Sea. I wanted to start, obviously there is a huge amount of stories and legends around these wonderful flowers, but I wanted to start with one in particular, which is a Persian legend from the 6th century of the story of Farhad, who was from a modest background but had fallen in love with Princess Shireen. And her father, not wanting her to fall in love and marry him, had spread rumours that she had died. And overcome with grief, Farhad throws himself from the top of the mountain, where each of the drops of blood fell onto the barren rocks of the mountain and sprung up in these scarlet spiky tulips. And so this is the very start of where tulips come from, or as they're known to have come from. And the tulip remains a symbol of enduring love in Iran to this day. And so this original tulip, the tulip Echeleri, is a hardy, low-growing tulip, very different to the ones which we now buy in Europe. It's hardy, it's a survivor. It really lived within the seasons I'll come to this later, but in a way that the tulips that we grow now really don't do so much. So it would flower both in the spring and the autumn, and go dormant in the hot summers and the cold winters. And it quickly spread over the wilds of the Himalayan mountains, Caucasus, Tian Shan, Elburz, and Pamir mountain ranges of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. But it wasn't until the 10th century. I hope I've got all my images. Is this going? Yeah. It wasn't until the 10th century that tulips that originated from these wilds in the mountains began to be cultivated in Persia and later in Turkey. And it's from this point onwards that the story of the tulip coming into Jennifer's work starts, really. So from this moment of it having this complex engagement and entanglement with networks of human desire and exchange. In the 11th century, celebrated Persian poets were writing about tulips, and by the 14th century, tulips were being transported from the wild to adorn the gardens of wild palaces. They'd already taken on this kind of economic significance of wealth. And they spread throughout the Ottoman Empire, commemorated in place names and appearing in the far reaches of the Ottoman Empire. This is a tile, for instance, but you see it in ceramics and in textiles, and in miniatures and headstones and illustrated manuscripts. Really, tulips are kind of adorn anything which needs to be adorned. By the 18th century, the obsession of the tulip had entered an entirely new era. So Sultan Ahmed III had become known as the tulip era. And really, it was at this point you kind of think of tulips being this kind of fancy of the kind of Western world where new species are bred all the time. But actually, it was around this period that Turkish florists were starting to name different species, and they were already setting up councils of people that would judge how beautiful, how pristine a different tulips of different species were, and giving them official names as well was happening around this period. And it's from this period onwards that they start to emigrate to Europe. So this is a wonderful image, isn't it? In the late 16th century, travellers brought back stories of these brilliant, much prized Lys Rouge tulips that were at this point unheard of in Europe, and they had adorned botanical gardens throughout history. And these newly imported blooms then became the must-have commodity across Europe. It was around this time, 1602, at the start of the Dutch East India Company, that's still believed to be, I believe, the largest company ever to existed, was making its fortunes. And because of that wealth that was coming into the country, there was a new wealth amongst people in the Netherlands to spend money excessively, which they did on tulips. And so merchants' gardens were really this place of like having the tulip as a status symbol. And from this point onwards, botanists really started producing many more varieties, hybridizing the flower through many different ways, which I can talk about a little bit later, and creating lots of mutations that then created higher and higher prices. And so, this is around the time that I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of tulip mania. But one of the richest men in the Netherlands at the time, even Adrian Pauw, couldn't afford to plant thousands of tulips. So instead, they would cluster tulips and have mirrors around the garden to appear to have an excessive amount of tulips. And I have this wonderful quote which I'd like to read by philosopher Justus Lipsius. They do vaingloriously hunt after strange herbs and flowers, which having gotten they preserve and cherish more carefully than any mother does her child. These be the men whose letters fly abroad to Tharkia, Greece, and India, only for a little root or seed. These men will be more grieved of the loss of a newfound flower than for an old friend. And so this tulip that's up on screen is the Rembrandt flower, which you might recognise. And it was this that really started the tulip mania, as it became known. And this tulip was so difficult to grow. We now know that it was caused by a virus in the tulip bulb, which meant it had this beautiful split colour, but it also meant that it was a very weak plant, and so it was difficult to cultivate bulbs that would actually come into flower. And because it was so difficult, it meant that it was extremely expensive to buy, and very speculative, of course, because you're buying a bulb and you don't know if it's going to come into flower. And so it said that to buy one of these tulip bulbs would cost 15 years' wages of the average Dutch bricklayer, or the price of a townhouse in the best quarter of Amsterdam. So they were insanely expensive for one tulip bulb. And that all came to an abrupt end in 1637. And it's the reason I think it's so wonderful to bring in this story of tulip mania into the story of Jennifer's collages coming into being is that it's really a marker of the world as we know it now. So tulip mania was the first example of a speculative financial bubble. One which we now all exist in as if it's completely normal. And when so the market prices aren't based on any intrinsic value, but just on the desire of people to have this beautiful thing, which doesn't in itself have any intrinsic value, and are willing to pay it. And so these two major developments developed into kind of the global market societies that we have now, the Dutch East India Company as the first vertical supply chain, and tulip mania representing the accumulation of wealth and capital in this speculative way rather than objective value. So those two things that came about through the tulip in a way have shaped everything in the way that we live in a capitalist Western society now, and they've changed our planet and our way of being irreversibly. So actually, just to stay on this one, so this is an image from Hortus Bulborium, the place which is this living museum with all the tulips. And because it's got a virus, it has to sit completely separately in the field. It's now completely forbidden to grow them commercially. How are we doing for time? Shall I skip through some stuff? Let's not go backwards. So maybe one thing that I would really like to speak about is that this relationship to time. So when the tulips growed in the wild, in the mountains, they had this relationship to the seasons. And now both Jennifer's collages and the tulips themselves are innately related to the care of the person who's handling them. So obviously the tulip collages are a huge labour of love, but just to create the tulips is also this process of they can't stay in the ground. They have to be cycled through the earth. They have to be taken out and dried out because the earth is too wet and cold in the winter, and dried and then replanted. And Pete, who I have got a photo of, I hope. Maybe not. Yeah, Peter's in the book. He's been working in these fields since he was 6 years old. It's really this knowledge that is passed down generation to generation, and he'll pass this on to his son and his nephews. And for him, with other cooperative growers, if they want to develop a new species for the market, each bulb takes 6 years to create its first bloom, and then 20 years to develop into a commercially viable product. And so it's really this labour of love and dedication and patience and care just to come up with these tulip petals that are in the work. So I maybe want to end on just a recognition that there's so many other roots to these stories, and I think that's true in all of Jennifer's work also, is that you can read stories through particular lenses and particular roots, I guess. But the one that I wanted to bring up in the essay was this kind of this idea that these two things, Jennifer as an artist who is undeniably Dutch, who represents the Netherlands in biennials and things, and this kind of, whenever you have a biog, you have the artist's nationality in brackets, and the tulip, which is also seen as undeniably Dutch, but actually who have these heritage and kinships through many other roots into being. And so within this single tulip petal, what I've called petal cum feather, can be read the complex entanglements of the flora and fauna that have shaped the cultural imagination, embedded into our histories, our worldviews, our sense of collective individuality and identity. This fragile, ephemeral petal cum feather has equally been shaped by politics, economics, and commodities, transformed through histories by wars, empires, trade routes, colonialisms, capital flows, extraction, pollutants, and ideologies. It's a fiction of desire that has solidified and transformed realities.
Oh, you're getting an applause. Take it. It's this idea of the whole world in a grain of sand, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
And so I'm just going to pick out one little thing which I'm going to ask you to kind of bring to Jennifer's Tampan Tulips. And it's this idea of shapeshifter. So it's a petal cum feather. It's what you say, the tulip bulb, which is diseased, but then becoming a very precarious or prestigious, expensive commodity. And so it's always this kind of doubleness or tripleness or quadrupleness, how do you say? Which is how I read your essay. It's like this kind of unfolding of all these different dimensions. So if you take one Tampan Tulip by Jennifer, how does that kind of shape-shifting, if you bring that to the work, what would you...
Maybe it's just a question of perception and how you're reading things, because I guess like the species of tulips have transformed over the centuries, but to look at the tulip within the collage, it can be both or many at one time, and I think that's true in much of the items or the imagery or the materials that are brought into this kind of cacophony or cosmology of things that play in Jennifer's work, is that actually it's the relationship to one another that they're playing off. And so, yes, there's transformations, but there's also kind of symbiotic kind of duality. There's a fluidity and a multitude at once.
Yeah, and that's the thing I wanted to get to before we ask Jennifer and Cleo to join us and kind of delve into the book. This taking up again the metaphor of weaving. When you weave, it's like you fix things into a specific binding. You take one system of threads and you weave the other and you fix it. But that's the new surface that emerges at that point in time, and you can put all the symbolic of touch, etc., etc. But every time I try to fix Jennifer's work, and it's really weird to talk about her work when she's just sitting over there, every time I try to fix it to one particular combination of things or a particular combination of three things, it kind of, it kind of escapes. Yeah. It's like mercury. It's like you... and I had to think about that experience when I was reading your essay as well. So maybe you can you elaborate a little bit of that? Do you recognize that?
Yeah, I think something that I was really thinking about when you were both speaking about weaving is that actually weaving, as I don't know very much about weaving, but from the little I do know, I understand is that weaving is often a collective activity, a communal activity. It's often in many cultures a place where people come together as a group activity, or it's often used as a place for kind of almost collective thinking or collective therapy, or often used as a way of social activation also. And so in a way that's what's happening here in the single collage also. It's bringing in this multitude of different histories and voices, and so it almost becomes a collective space.
Thank you.
In itself.
Yeah. Thanks. So I would like to invite Jennifer and Cleo to the table, and maybe we can switch to the last PowerPoint. And meanwhile, I'm gonna ask Wonu a question, kind of trying to tread on from what Sophie just said about, and I have to gather my thoughts here. This idea of a multitude, you said it beautifully, a multitude of different realities, resources, all kind of put in one, and then the minute you try to put a form to it, it kind of evaporates, or it kind of shifts form. And this mindset of putting things into order, of fixating things, of putting things in their right perspective, the right place in an archive, which is an ethnographic museum, which is where you are working, and which very much is what we would call the Western Enlightenment mindset. We think in theories, we think in a kind of linear approach to history, everything which is, for me at least, the opposite of what the artwork of Jennifer proposes. Huh? So how do you, and you talked about barkcloth as a very multisensorial space. We talked about the women's work, the hard work that went into it, which is not something that you can actually archive. So can you say something about that kind of, those dimensions? Like how can we deal with those dimensions?
I think, that's one of the big, that's okay. That's one of the big questions that we're also dealing with in our museums today, because a lot of the categories that we're using don't really fit the objects or the entities that are in our museums, and especially if you look at what indigenous peoples have to say about the things that we hold in the museums, you quite quickly discover that it's far more complex than what we have put in our search terms, because you can look for a textile, but a textile is not necessarily only a textile, it's much more than that. And that's one of the things that we're actually struggling with, or we're not, it's one of the challenges that we're trying to deal with. And how do you make, for example, databases that are accessible to people who don't necessarily think in these categories that we have set ourselves? And I think that's a very interesting aspect of, the museum world today, because it kind of combines indigenous viewpoints, but also combines the use of technology today. So how do you make these two worlds meet in a constructive way that serves the purposes of indigenous peoples, but also serves the purposes of the museum? And I think, like, when we are talking about barkcloth, for example, what the women also say is that it's full of love. Mm-hmm. The work is full of love. What they say, it's ofa. They always use that term. It's all the love that we put into it. And that's something that you don't see in the database.
No.
If you look at love, you search for that. You don't necessarily get barkcloth.
And I also find it fascinating what you said before about it was, we can call it a colonial mindset, but it was in a certain era that, especially the Tampan and the Palepai that we have today in our ethnographic museum in Holland, in the Netherlands, it was a specific type of collector which looked at these objects with a specific frame of reference. So I'm always fantasizing that because of that frame of reference, something might be miscategorized or misinterpreted or misunderstood, and maybe miss whatever.
Or not even collected. And that's also one of the big things that we see in museums, is that of course, people had a particular viewpoint on what they were interested in, and therefore were automatically not interested in other things. And so, therefore, for example, that's a famous example. We have thousands and thousands of spears, because most of the collectors, especially for the Pacific, most of the collectors were men, often military men, and they were interested in weapons. and so, but they were not necessarily interested in bags, and that is also a representative aspect of the culture, because bags were at least as important as spears were. But so you get a very skewed view of particular societies as well. And I think also with the textiles, often they were interested in particular motifs or particular. So that's probably also one of the reasons that these are called ship cloths, because the collectors were probably more interested in the ships than in perhaps other motifs that were at least as significant. Probably, I don't know. I'm not a specialist on these textiles, but so these are some of the ways that you have to be very careful when you are dealing with ethnographic collections, that you always get a kind of biased or skewed view of what was out there.
Yeah, I've always wondered, we have the Stone Age, we have the Iron Age, we've got the Copper Age, no.
Yeah.
But we never have the Textile Age. It's all no, probably because it's a very fragile material, I understand, but it's one of the oldest techniques that we master. Welcome. I want to ask you a question. And then I'll introduce Cleo. Yeah. So you don't have to feel out. Yeah. So when Wonu talked, and we talked a bit about this. Well, you actually saw your first Palepai, I think, at the Tropenmuseum, didn't you? Yeah. And you once told me that you came across the textiles when you were researching ceremonial textiles. So I kind of assume that you had an interest in the more spiritual dimension of the textiles. Can you maybe say something about that first encounter?
Yeah, so I was asked to make a proposal for an artwork for the North-South line, the Metro line, the Amsterdam Metro line. And at that moment I was living in New York for a year on a residency. And the brief for that commission was to connect the local with the world, and seeing Central Station as sort of the place where people would kind of start their journeys if they would be coming from abroad. So I was thinking, like, what's very, very Dutch, and then came to the tulip, and also thinking of the tulip and the tulip fields as maybe looking like a weaving, and also in my work I have been using materials that maybe say something about the place of its origins. And then I was thinking, like, thinking of the tulip as a material to use as a textile. I was thinking, but what kind of textile? What kind of imagery would I want to make for that commission? And so that's when I started to research ceremonial cloths. And then came across these schependoeken, or ship cloths. Yeah, and at that moment when I saw them, I was like, oh, I think this is something I would really want to understand more.
And your first attraction was the image of the ship.
Yes, and also two things. So the image of the ship, and of course its meaning, this idea of the voyage to the unknown, or this afterlife, but also visually, I really liked the combination of very abstract elements, like the ship, and very detailed figurative elements. So the humans and the animals making this journey.
Because there's, like, I've put two things together once. One time I put an original tampan or an historical tampan next to one of yours, and it's quite you can see the connections between the kind of the iconography of the original ones, which I think I asked you once, like, do you know what they exactly meant, or are they more like archetypical symbols? We can see the bird-like figure, the kind of elongated toad. There's a womb-like structure, which I don't know if it's actually in the original tampons, is it?
Yeah.
but that we kind of lost the knowledge of its original meaning. So when we talk about the work that you made for the Centraal Station, this symbol of the ship took on contemporary meanings, which I think is what I very much like about this thing, that it has all these historical threads. The historical thread that Sophie explained about the tulip petal, your biographical threads. It has the history of the Tampan and the Palepai, but it's very of the here and now, the works that you make. This is not a question, is it? So maybe we can come in, what it connects is this idea of time, that you said it takes a whole year to create two new works, no? Because of the natural rhythm of the tulips.
Yeah, not really a year, but maybe it does take time to, like, I do like to take the year sort of to think about maybe the next works that I would like to make and what I want to connect them to. And then the physical work is, harvesting the tulips in the tulip season. So that's what I've just been doing. And then starts the making of the collages.
But then there's a kind of visual or ideas that, like, it's not like you don't do the same motif over and over again. It changes, no? There's a kind of narrative to each new work.
Yeah.
Which comes from?
It comes from, getting to know these motifs better and better. So, I've been collecting images of existing tampan from different collections. So it started with the ones that I saw at the Tropenmuseum, and then I started to collect some books, and then knowing maybe some other collections worldwide, and looking at those and thinking about, which ones I'm thinking of maybe translating to new collages.
So it is a process of translation and interpretation.
Yeah.
So if you go to Jennifer's website, but also if we see the catalogue, I'll quickly introduce Cleo, so everyone knows who's sitting there. So Cleo, and I was dismissed of having to pronounce your last name, but Tsw is a Singapore-born graphic designer and writer based in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. She runs, of course, a publishing imprint operating out of Amsterdam, where she also publishes her own work, and which she describes as a publishing platform concerned with cross-genre reading and writing, paying attention to how image, text, and composition can be approached to elicit the essence and meaning of a subject. Yeah? So in addition, she's coordinator of the graphic design department of the Gerrit Rietveld, and currently the participant at Critical Studies Sandberg Institute. But most importantly, she is the designer of this beautiful catalogue. So you've heard us share kind of histories, some of the historical threads that go into Jennifer's work. You probably had to take a deep dive into her works as well before you started to visualize and conceptualize the catalogue. A lot of the research that Jennifer has done is in the back. So I have a number of questions. It's quite a bold catalogue, and you've taken some beautiful bold decisions. There's the blank pages, it's the changing of the material of the page, which kind of, I think, kind of remembers or references the structure and texture that you talked about, Wonu. What was the decision, how did you make the decision to put this kind of the research in the back? How did you kind of structure how did you come up with the structure of the book?
Yeah, it's a really good. Firstly, I just got so much just hearing all of you talk, and I kind of like that you brought in this idea of vocabulary and bringing this the vocabulary of weaving and textiles into the processes of art making. and I can also like kind of transfer that vocabulary into a book. And if I think of what you mentioned about kind of, you know, having to weave something and to tie something down and bind it, that's exactly what the brief was, to kind of make a book and, you know, function within the medium of the book. But then at the same time, the making of the book was highly unorthodox for me. Like, I think in working with Jennifer, the processes of making a book were kind of flipped around. We very much designed the book together, and a lot of decisions with the kind of sequence of the book were made in conversation. So the decision to put all the kind of research material and references right in the back was really the result of a conversation about how the book should function, and we really very much wanted a kind of like focus and attention on the images and the color and the kind of aesthetics of the material for a big portion of the book, and then to kind of equally give attention to the references, but to kind of clearly demarcate it at the back rather than, so that you have two kind of uninterrupted experience of the book.
Yeah, and that really works. It's when I kind of went through the book, it was the petal that comes first. It's like this is the origin, this is the starting point. And you could have taken so many different entry points to the series of Tampan Tulips, but you took the very material, the living thing. Do you want to say something about do you have any ideas about the book?
Well, I was gonna, the book is beautiful. But also just in relationship, I guess, to what you were saying, is that like it's actually really hard material to work with, the tulips, because they, like the images of the tulips, the fields are so striking in themselves, and so you kind of see, I don't know if you can find like a double spread where it's just a tulip field, but like they're, you know, the fields themselves are just these vast stripes of super bright colours. And what I think you've done so beautifully in the book is to be able to like really get up close and intimate and understand, like, yeah, these kind of, you just get swathes of colour. I mean, some of them are exceptionally bright, especially when it was sunny when we were there. They're just super bright fields. But the book gets up so close and really understands that kind of how tactile they are, and the minutiae of differences and variations between each of the variants.
I'm made aware that we're kind of running out of time, and I'm sorry if I've taken up most of the time. No, I haven't, but I'm sorry if I have. And just, do we have time for some questions from anyone here? Yeah?
Oh, do you need a... Oh.
Hello? Oh, sorry. To continue on the design of the book, I was wondering about the cropping, actually, and the white pages, if you could speak a little bit about that, because I'm guessing those are one of the bold decisions that you were mentioning. Thanks.
So the crops of the books, they kind of have a loose categorization, and they're kind of categorized based on motifs. So like
based
one
on,
of...
I'm sorry? Based on what?
The motifs of the book. So there's like a section on boats, and then there's a section on animals, and it's a kind of it's not mentioned anywhere. So if you kind of pick up on that, it's great, but otherwise it's also okay. And I guess that's what the white pages come from. They a bit separate each motif. But then they also act like a folio, I guess, like the idea of like just sifting through in a very focused way that brings attention to each thing.
They reminded me of the shelves with where Jennifer like dries the petals, and they've got these like leaves in between. That was my reading of them, was that they were these blank pages that were the leaves drying out the petals between.
Yeah.
Do you want to continue the question? No?
Is it one-to-one scale, or what about the scale of the images?
Yeah, so we did try that. In the end, it couldn't work because, for example, the boats, they were so beautiful, and we really wanted to show them in their totality. So then but there was a version where we really wanted to keep things at 1-to-1. So, for example, there's a section at the beginning where we show the tulip petals in single petals, and those are 1-to-1 scale. Yeah, but that was definitely one direction that we were kind of persistent to pursue for a while.
Yeah, and it allows you to kind of near to, if we talk about time and about history and all these things that kind of give gravitas to the work, it allows you to really come up close.
Yeah.
Not just in a physical, how do you say it, in a visual way, but also you can really kind of near your relation to the work. Are there any other questions? Is there something that you would like to add or ask or say, as this is kind of almost the closing? No? Yeah? Yes?
To both Cleo and Jennifer, is that Jennifer, you have many other really stunningly beautiful publications that may be smaller and maybe more modest in some ways. But what was it about this publication? What was it that you wanted it to, for both of you? Like, what was the role that you wanted it to have? How does it operate differently to the other publications?
So I think when I got the invitation to make an exhibition for Secession, and they also do artist books, I was very, very happy because it was on my mind that I wanted to make a book on the collages at some moment, because I think of the richness of the material and also the stories. And then I was already working with Cleo on other things, and so I was immediately thinking of asking Cleo to work with me on the book. And and then that was just the journey to go through all the materials and the process of how the work is made, and and selecting the essays.
I think it's a really beautiful book, so I want to congratulate you both.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and anyone who doesn't have a copy, I would say it's really worthwhile your spent. So what we try to do, I don't know if there's any more people who want to ask a question, but what we try to do is to unravel some of the threads that run through Jennifer's work. I think the exhibition runs till Sunday. So go, if you haven't seen it yet, go and see it. And there's another performance scheduled also for Sunday. 4 o'clock? 6 o'clock?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock. Yeah. 3 o'clock. Thank you very much for sitting with us, and wishing you a really good weekend. Thank you, Wonu. Thank you, Cleo. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks.